Hello, time travellers of my acquaintance. As always, it's lovely to have you with me as we travel through time and space, wherever will we end up next. This particular episode means a great deal to me. They all do. That the Fortingall Yew is like nothing else. There's 100 places in the story of the British Isles. This one exists, in my imagination, it's like the monolith in 2001. You know, the Arthur C. Clarke movie? And there's that obelisk, that monolith that appears. It appears on the moon. It appears amongst the ape creatures that are on the point of becoming human beings. And there's no explanation given for it. It's just there. The Fortingall Yew is like that for me. It is where it's always been. For perhaps 9,000 years it's been growing in Glen Lyon in the centre of Scotland, but its significance moves through time. It's relevant everywhere and every when. If it is 9,000 years old, it's the oldest living thing in Europe. Everything we care about, rise and fall of empires, kings and queens, wars, enlightenment, industrial revolution, it's all happened, metaphorically speaking, in the shadow of the Fortingall Yew. It stands for something. Even now, after thinking about it endlessly, I'm not sure exactly what it stands for, but it's always there, and like everything else, I live in its shadow. Before we get started, I'd like to say a big thanks to everyone who's signed up to my Patreon site. It's the support given to Patreon that makes everything else possible. The other podcasts always have been, always will be free, but that's on account of the Patreon presence. If you're not a member and you'd like to become one, go to patreon.com, search for me by name, follow the steps, part with some cash, either monthly or for the year. It's a bit cheaper if you do it all in one go. And become part of a family of like-minded time-travelling thinkers, interested in history, questions to ask about the present, opportunities to talk to me, question me, communicate with each other, share ideas. What could be better? Okay, it's now time to strap ourselves into the time machine as we set off on another episode of my love letter to the British Isles. You'll never again in your life have the opportunity to stand beside or in the shadow of anything in the whole of Europe that's been alive for longer. In this podcast, we're walking in a magical glen, the loveliest in Scotland, according to Sir Walter Scott. Before being whisked off to Rome and into the history books, legend has it that Pontius Pilate was born here. Somewhere that has always mattered to our ancestors. A place of striking beauty that invites deep contemplation. And found within it, still fit and healthy despite its colossal, almost unimaginable age, is what's believed to be the oldest living thing in Europe. I'm stepping out across Britain to discover 100 remarkable places that have shaped you, me, and the whole world. I'm Neil Oliver, and this is my love letter to the British Isles.
Hi Neil. Last week we found out you've been the warm-up act to Bono and U2 on the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury. Where are we now?
Yeah, don't you forget it. Don't let anyone forget I was the warm-up act for U2 in 2011. Shout it from the rooftops. Well, this week we're far from the madding, raucous crowds and loud music of Glastonbury, maybe as a person could hope to get, to the gentle dappled light in the shadow of ancient trees, in one of the most beautiful, loneliest glens in Scotland. This week we're in Perthshire to encounter the legendary Fortingall Yew. The destination, or the source of the love letter this week, is the Fortingall Yew, as in yew tree, and it's in Glen Lyon, around about the middle part of Scotland. And it's another of those ones that stands out a little bit like the Amesbury Archer or the Alfred Jewel in a way, in that because it's a tree, I suppose you might say it's more of a thing than a place, but it is very much a destination. And the reasons for being confident in calling it a destination will become clear, I think, as our conversation unfolds. And I'll freely admit it brings out the kind of dreamer in me. The idea of the possible reality of the Fortingall Yew just blows my mind. It opens my mind up to all sorts of images and ideas and thoughts. It's just the most extraordinary entity, I would say. So, the reason for it, yew trees are quite special in amongst the whole family of trees. The yew is quite something. They're amongst the trees that are especially long-lived. So you've got the sequoia in California, there's the bristlecone pines, there's the baobabs in Africa, trees that live for not hundreds but for thousands of years. And the yew tree is one of those. Its special gift, I suppose you would say, is its power to regenerate. A yew tree, if it's cut down, even right down at the ground surface, and you would think it was dead, it has regenerative powers, so it will send forth new life just from the roots. And so it's been a potent symbol of life for thousands of years, and it was certainly picked up on by Christians because it tied in with the idea of Jesus having been crucified and died and then sprung back to life. And so because the yew tree exhibits the same potential, the early Christians latched on to yew trees where they found them. And you quite often will find a yew tree, an old yew tree that was planted in a churchyard. And it's also a good idea for practical reasons to keep a yew tree behind a wall because the berries are toxic for cattle. And I think even the leaves.
Wood from yew trees is also known for making brilliant bows, isn't it?
Yes. Famously the longbow, the English longbow that was used to such deadly effect at Agincourt and other famous medieval battles are made of the good red yew, as they called it. I think because the wood is slow growing, it's very strong. I mean, if you've ever tried to draw something that's been built to the dimensions required for a war bow that would have shot an arrow for in excess of 200 metres with pinpoint accuracy, if you ever get the opportunity to try and pull one of those, you can't. You simply can't because they're so strong. The flexibility is there, but that's why the archers, the longbowmen of yore, were trained from boyhood. It was compulsory that they practice daily, weekly, from boyhood onwards to develop the necessary musculature and the muscle memory that enabled them to operate these things. If I gave you a war bow made of yew, there'd be nothing you could do with it. You wouldn't even be able to bend it enough to get the string on it. They're incredibly strong. So yes, for most people, they might have heard of yew trees in the context of churchyards because they're so commonplace in Christian churchyards. But the other way in which people would have been familiar with yew is that the wood of the yew tree was famously used to create these astonishing bits of kit that were so dominant in the battlefields of the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries. So, within the family of trees, yew trees are pretty special. And the Fortingall Yew is in the village of Fortingall, which is in Glen Lyon. Glen Lyon is, well, it's a special place. Sir Walter Scott, great Scottish author, called Glen Lyon the longest, loveliest and loneliest in all of Scotland. And so it is. The glen's about 25 miles long. It stretches from Fortingall into the west all the way to Loch Lyon. And there are good reasons, archaeological reasons especially, for thinking that, or for knowing that it mattered to people for thousands of years. Archaeologists have found settlements going back to the Neolithic and also then into the Bronze Age and into the Iron Ages. So there's been people there for a long time.
And they've found artefacts there?
Yeah. It's one of those valleys within Scotland, within Britain. There's another in Scotland called Kilmartin, over towards the west, that has a similarly long life in terms of its having pulled people into it for unknown thousands of years. But Fortingall, we've always got to get back to Fortingall and to the yew tree. It's in a churchyard in Fortingall, which is a very pretty little place. It was largely developed in the latter part of the 19th century. There was a wealthy ship owner and philanthropist called Sir Donald Currie, and he bought large tracts of land, and the school was built and the church was built, and it's a pretty little place. But the thing about the Fortingall Yew is it's dendrochronologists, the scientists who measure the age of trees, and tree specialists, they'll certainly allow that the Fortingall Yew is 3,000 years old. As a sort of a benchmark, as a line in the sand, you'd say it's 3,000 years old. But there are enough who allow for the possibility that it's 9,000 years old. 9,000 years old. Now, that's where my mind starts to open up like a flip-top bin. And 9,000 years old, because that would make the Fortingall Yew the oldest living thing in the whole of Europe. Now, pause and take a breath and think about that. Because if it's 9,000 years old, that means that tree has been growing and living while everything we care about has happened. We've talked before in the love letter, the Montrose Basin in Scotland has evidence of the Storega slide, which caused the tsunami that cut what had been a peninsula of Europe into a set of islands, and we've been islands ever since. Now, that was 8,000 years ago. So that means that by the time that happened, the Fortingall Yew might already have been 1,000 years old. Right, so this is old. So when everyone came, when the hunters walked in dry-shod into the peninsula of northwestern Europe that became the British Isles, the Fortingall Yew was there. And elsewhere in the world, while civilizations, Mesopotamia, Ur, Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Rome, rise and fall, world wars, industrial revolutions, man to the moon, the internet, all of that has happened, metaphorically speaking, in the shadow of the Fortingall Yew. Now, I can't imagine living inside a head that doesn't find that impossibly fascinating. Just as a possibility. Utterly captivates me. And for obvious reasons, it's inspired people to think all sorts of things. In Scotland, and in Fortingall in particular, there's an abiding tradition or a belief that Pontius Pilate was a Scot. Now, Pontius Pilate, he's one of those, how much can you really know about a character from the New Testament? According to Roman records, there was a man called Pontius Pilate who was the procurator of Judea from AD 26 to AD 36. That much seems to be historical fact. Procurator means he was in charge. He was the Roman governor of that. Even then, it was a hotbed of religious schism and unrest and all the rest of it. But he it was that famously presided over the trial of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ had suitably annoyed the Hebrew, the Jewish population, or some of them, among whom he lived, and they accused him of blasphemy because he said he was the Son of God. And they didn't like that, amongst other things. He was trouble as far as they were concerned. And they basically dobbed him in to the Roman authorities and they wanted an end of him, and they got it. And Pontius Pilate agreed to have him crucified, which was what those that were Christ's enemies had been after in the first place. So there's Pontius Pilate. That's his infamous role in history. But there's always been an abiding folk legend in Scotland that Pontius Pilate was born here. Now, Pontius Pilate may have been just a born Roman from somewhere within the territory that we know as Italy. There's other testimony or reasons for thinking he was a German, or that he might have been a Spaniard. but in Scotland they say no. Now, you have to allow yourself a moment to maybe possibly unpick what might be going on there. So where does this idea come from, this possibility that Pontius Pilate is a Scot? Well, we've discussed before in the context of the love letter that before the Claudian Roman invasion of Britain in 43-44 AD, there had been earlier attempts, and Julius Caesar certainly made a couple of attempts about 100 years before that. In the 50s BC, he brought an army across and tried to claim Britain as Britannia, and it failed. He made 2 stabs at it, one year after the other, and then just abandoned the exercise. But it's perfectly legitimate to imagine that even before Caesar got there, that there were links between the Roman world and our archipelago. Because, there was stuff here that the Romans were interested in. Slaves, for one thing, tin, copper, gold. There was stuff worth having. So it's perfectly reason to imagine that after Caesar's abortive attempt to take ownership, that the contact continued on. Because there, as well as being a military entity, the Roman Empire, it was a business. It was a corporation. And so they would have maintained contact with our part of the world. So they'd have had agents, if you like, dotted about, people, pressing the flesh, mixing, getting to know the locals, always nudging the possibility forward inch by inch of eventually successfully colonising these British Isles. So it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that as well as having made contacts in the south, they would have had agents in the north, in what the Romans knew or came to know as Caledonia. So you could have had Romans in Scotland, just checking the lie of the land. Now, it's known that in what we call Glen Lyon and in Perthshire, there was a powerful local warlord called Metalanus. And no doubt, perfectly reasonable to think that the Romans would have made contact with him to curry favour with him. So if there was a small contingent of Romans there doing what they could, it's also not unreasonable to imagine that maybe one of them got involved with a local woman from that tribe, and married, or some equivalent of married. And then a child is born to a Roman legionary and a local woman. And that child, well, that could give you an explanation for the birth of Pontius Pilate. And then subsequently, according to the story, the father, now with his wife and child, were relocated back to elsewhere in the Roman Empire, so that in adulthood, this Pontius Pilate, who'd been born in Glen Lyon, is now in a position to become the procurator of Judea. So the story goes in Glen Lyon that Pontius Pilate once sat beneath the Fortingall Yew, which is just the most... It's just, the very idea of it, it's just another of those... We talk about the world being a small place, as though it's our invention. And to some extent it is, obviously, with the advent of modern travel and jet aircraft and all the rest of it. We've made the world smaller. But the connections were already international, even thousands of years ago. And it is, why not? Why wouldn't it be possible that somebody who starts out in life born in Fortingall subsequently ends up living out their adulthood elsewhere in the world? Now, Edwin Morgan, great Scottish poet, and I think in 1984, or there or thereabouts, he wrote a poem. It's called Pilate at Fortingall. And it's all about the idea that at the end of his life, in his retirement, in his dotage, if you like, Pontius Pilate, as an old man, came back to Fortingall. And the poem has as this bedraggled, desperate madman who is seen around the neighbourhood going to, say, the cattle trough and washing his hands over and over again, as though he's riven with guilt about having allowed Jesus Christ to be crucified. And so he washes his hands endlessly, never satisfied that he has washed off the guilt. He does it over and over again. It's a wonderful, evocative poem, and it brings to mind the out damned spot that Lady Macbeth says. The regicide of Duncan, and first of all, it's Macbeth, her husband, that can't sleep. He becomes insomniac because of his guilt. Macbeth has murdered sleep, and Lady Macbeth takes the mickey out of him for a while, but then she too, as the guilt begins to corrupt and corrode her, she finds that she can't sleep, and then she becomes preoccupied with blood on her hands that she can't wash off, out, damned spot, and so on. So it's that idea of the mark of permanent guilt. So that's woven through the story of the Fortingall Yew. And when I come to think about the tree, when I come to think about the Fortingall Yew, I'm never quite sure where to place it chronologically. You know, this love letter starts 1,000,000 years ago with the footprints on the beach at Haysborough, and it comes right through to modern times eventually. You know, it's a love letter about 1,000,000 years of history. And when I came to think about and to talk about the Fortingall Yew, I was never quite sure where to place it. But not least because there is uncertainty about its age, but I think about the Fortingall Yew a bit like the monolith in Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey. You know, that stone, it appears first of all on the moon, I think, and then it appears, you know, at times in Earth's ancient past, and, you know, the ape creatures, throw sticks at it, and so on and so on. But the idea is that the monolith has just always been there. It's eternal. And I think about the Fortingall Yew in that way, that in terms of the human story, it feels like something that has always been there. You know, and I said at the start that it brings out the dreamer in me. I think about how the elements, the atoms that are in all of us are famously the stuff of burned out stars. You know, everything of which we are made was created, forged, conjured into being inside stars, and when those stars died, those elements were scattered into the universe, and they keep combining and recombining as other things, and they're in us for a while, and then when we die, the elements of which we are composed will scatter and then recombine elsewhere later on as other things. And I think about how for a while some of the elements of the universe have been in the form of the Fortingall Yew for 9,000 years. And perhaps the time will come when the Fortingall Yew is no more. It will finally die. It will finally come to the end of its life, and then those elements will go out and become something else. In a sense, within my love letter to the British Isles, thinking about these 100 places that make up the love letter to the British Isles, the Fortingall Yew acts as my monolith, the monolith from 2001. It's there somehow in the background of everything, casting its arboreal shadow over everything. And surely its presence in Glen Lyon will have been something that drew people. When we've talked about places like the Ness of Brodgar and Stonehenge and Avebury and Silbury Hill, and we've speculated about the possibility that word of the existence of those places spread far and wide into the ancient world, so that people came on pilgrimage to see them. In relation to Stonehenge, we talked about the Amesbury archer, the skeleton of the man who died and was buried around the time when the finishing touches were being put to Stonehenge. And I've certainly entertained the idea that he was drawn because from his place of birth, south of the Pyrenees, he'd heard about whatever they called Stonehenge, and he came to see it and ended up living out the rest of his life there. Well, surely word of the tree that had been there forever would have spread, and people would have come. I mean, wouldn't you go? If you heard about a tree that no one could remember a time when it wasn't there, you'd want to go and have a look at it. And so surely that explains why there's been such a long story of human occupation, habitation of Glen Lyon. Because at least in part, people would have been drawn by the opportunity to stand in its shadows. There's all sorts of history dotted about. There's a little hill nearby, it's called Moot Hill. Within it, there's an ancient stone carved with a cross, and it's called St. Adovnan's Cross. Now, Adovnan was the man, the saint, who wrote the hagiography, the biography of Columba on Iona. And it's Adovnan who's said to have chased the plague out of Glen Lyon. at some point during his life. And elsewhere in the valley, there's a grassy mound called the Cairn of the Dead, and it's said to mark a mass grave of villagers who died during a later outbreak of plague. And the tradition has it that only one old woman survived. Everyone else died, and this old woman took on the responsibility for looking after the bodies of the dead. And so all by herself, she dug the mass grave and put the bodies of all the villagers inside it, and then raised this cairn on top of it. So there's all sorts of mystical, spiritual, emotional inspirations around Glen Lyon and around Fortingall. And it seems undoubted to me that it's the tree that has inspired that. At different times, I mean, people have been making paintings and drawings of it down through the centuries, and more recently, obviously, there's been photographs of it. In 1769, the girth of it, if you put a string around the outside of its trunk in 1769, it was 52 feet.
Wow.
The life of the Fortingall Yew is like a kind of a wave. You know, it goes through crests and troughs, or it's like a light that's sometimes bright and sometimes dim. But the point is, it's still alive. It's still alive.
When you walk in the Glen, do you find it to be as lovely as Walter Scott says?
Well, I do. I would consider it to be, if you like it's not like the Highlands. You know, that the Highlands of the Northwest, they in some ways look older. They're frost shattered, the rock exposed. There can be more of a barren, aged appearance to the Highlands, beautiful though they undoubtedly are. There's in Perthshire, where you've got Glen Lyon, it's greener and gentler and more rounded. So it's very easy on the eye. I think it's a lovely place. There is a loneliness about it, not least because it's not particularly heavily populated. And so, you know, there's a silence there and an absence of people in certain points where you can be alone with yourself and you can get away from the ceaseless chatter of the modern world, and you can even allow yourself to forget who you are and just be there. Just be there like another living thing. Make a bit like the Fortingall Yew and just be there as the Fortingall Yew has been for 9,000 years. And I've said it before about other places. Maybe if you only had the time or the opportunity to target one of these places, you know, I've said before, maybe make it Iona, or maybe make it the Ness of Brodgar. Well, without a shadow of a doubt, I would say, if you only had the opportunity to target one, you might want to go and see the Fortingall Yew. Because if it's 9,000 years old, you'll never again in your life have the opportunity to stand beside or in the shadow of anything in the whole of Europe that's been alive for longer than that blessed tree. And I don't care to find out that any of that isn't true. I would rather retain and celebrate the possibility of all of it. All of it. The 9,000 years, the legend of Pontius Pilate, all of the other human stories that have unfolded around it, that are woven through it, somehow have become part of the Fortingall Yew. I want, and I believe, damn it, that all of it's true. Shining armour, knights on horseback, and a defiant army led by Robert the Bruce. A lazy, meandering river, an extinct volcano, with a grand, mighty castle sitting high upon its crag and tail. A bold, self-assured abbey where Scotland's future was plotted and planned. History hangs in the air here, so thick you can almost feel it brush against your face. Next time, in my love letter to the British Isles. Check out Neil Oliver Love Letter, the podcast's Instagram account. And to ensure you get each new episode of the podcast as it goes live, don't forget to subscribe Write a review and share with your friends. For further reading about these favourite destinations of mine, you could try my book. It's called The Story of the British Isles in 100 Places, and it's published by Transworld. Neil Oliver's love letter to the British Isles is produced by Paul Ratcliffe and Neil Oliver for Fat Belly Films. Music is by Malcolm Goldie. The social media producer is Oscar CFR. Additional research is by Evie, Lucian, Archie and Teddy. Finance is taken care of by Catherine and Trudy. Post-production is by Althorpe Studios, and the graphics are by Paul Plowman. And special thanks to the people across history who have made and continue to make these isles such an incredible place. This has been an FBF Podcasts production.